Okay. All right, can y'all see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So, like I said, composting and food waste, just reducing food waste, composting, and how to use your compost. Why should you compost? It saves money. Converting food scraps and yard trimmings to compost saves on buying soil amendments and fertilizers. You're saving time. Discarding the waste to compost often takes less time than hauling it off or waiting for the trash to run. And you're reducing your trash disposal, less landfill space, and less pollution. Some places, I was reading, Missouri is one state that doesn't allow like yard trimmings or grass or leaves or anything like that to be disposed of in landfills. So you may find yourself in a place that doesn't allow you to dispose of those things in landfills. So it's good to be able to compost them. The value of compost, it increases activity of microorganisms in the soil. For clay soils, it binds particles together to form crumbs. It improves aeration, improves root penetration, like how far down in the soil the roots can reach. And it improves water infiltration. I know a lot of us around here have pretty dense clay soils, so compost can really amend that and make those soils better. And then for sandy soils, it just improves nutrient and water retention. So compost formation, during the first stages, bacteria increases rapidly. And then bacteria, fungi, and protozoans, which are microorganisms, break down materials. And microorganisms release nutrients and other growth promoting materials into the soil. So they're necessary for good soil formation. And after much of the carbon is used and temperature is kind of fallen, the macroorganisms like earthworms, millipedes, things like that will continue decomposition. So let's see if it'll go to this video. Does it still say I'm on the slide or does it say I'm on the video?
Slide.
Okay, I'll have to.
No, your cursor is on video time lapse of composting.
Okay, let's see.
If you click it, you'll probably get it.
What about now? Can you see YouTube?
Yes.
Okay. And this is just, I think it's, I can't remember how, it's a 4-month period, time lapse of compost breaking down. So I thought that was kind of neat, just to see it break down. And they turned it, they said once a week, and watered it every time they turned it. I do have a slide about turning my compost, and I didn't recommend once a week in it, but as you can see in that video, it seemed to work pretty good. So it's really just whatever you're most comfortable with. And then this kind of just shows what the macro and microorganisms look like. The microorganisms are the ones that you would need like a microscope to see, like your bacteria, fungi, things like that. And then the macroorganisms are the ones you can see just with the unaided human eye or even like with a magnifying glass. So beetles, mites, nematodes, things like that. And then what to compost? kitchen scraps, vegetable garden trimmings, grass clippings, leaves, non-recyclable paper products. And this is just a few examples of what you can compost, which I'm sure y'all know. No infected or hazardous material should be composted, which meat, fish, dairy, oil, and bones, those are all more like animal products. But animals and pests will be attracted to these things. So you probably shouldn't include those in the compost, especially if you don't have like a covered bin that's completely enclosed. If your bin is on the ground, especially don't include these things. And like I said, no infected or hazardous material, like all of this garden damage from flooding, none of that can be included in your compost. None of the products you might have in your garden that were covered in flood water, none of that can go in because they're bacteria and viruses and everything else. So green and brown materials. Green materials are high in nitrogen. That's like grass clippings, food scraps, manure. And then brown materials are high in carbon. And that would be like dry leaves, wood chips, branches, things like that. Brown materials take longer to compost, and adding more green materials can speed up the process. That's just because the microorganisms require a lot of nitrogen to break everything down. So the more nitrogen that they have in there, the quicker they can break things down. So creating your pile location, it needs to be somewhere convenient for you. If you're using your compost mainly in your garden, it would be a good idea to locate your compost near your garden so you aren't having to travel far to get it. Near an available water source, compost does need to stay moist, not like soaking wet, but it does need to be like the equivalent of a wrung out towel. So don't locate it near where water stands. That can lead to like odor problems and even stop the process of your composting. Of course, if you have like a raised bin for it or it's not directly touching the ground, that won't be an issue if there is standing water. But if your compost is on the ground, it shouldn't be near standing water. And then shaded areas are good too. You don't want it getting too much sun and drying out. And then containing your compost, you can do a heap. Heaps require more space. They should be 5 by 5 and 3 feet high. And when you use a heap rather than a container, you should pull the upper like area of the compost and not use that on your garden because it's probably not completely decomposed. And heaps don't require turning as much. You can completely go without turning a heap and it'll still mostly decompose in the center at least, but you'll want to get the top layer off because it won't be decomposed. And containers require less space and air should be able to move through the sides because you need aeration and oxygen for your compost materials to break down. And another thing about like a heap and your location, if you have a heap or your pile is on the ground and it's possible for materials to kind of leach to the ground, you want to locate your compost near trees. Roots will be attracted to all the nitrogen stuff and they'll grow rapidly if they're able to access all of that. So, and then layering. Layering ensures that materials are added in proper proportion. You should lightly water each layer as it's added. Not completely saturate it, but water it just enough for it to retain moisture. And then mix it every 2 to 3 layers. So continuing on layering, layer 1 should be organic materials. That'll be like your first layer in your container or in your heap. It should be 6 to 8 inches and include shredded or chopped materials. Don't use materials that'll mat, and that's mainly just like grass clippings. These will mat up and they won't decompose or mix in with everything else if they're added in that level of thickness. So only add these in smaller layers or with like coarser materials. And then layer 2 should be fertilizer or manure. I spelled manure wrong, I'm realizing, but manure should be 1 to 2 inches if that's what you're using for this layer. Or if you're using a garden fertilizer, it should be 1 cup per 25 square feet of the top surface of each layer. And to avoid overwhelming the microorganisms, you can add fertilizer in several doses as the pile is turned, rather than like as a layer. Yeah, and don't add lime. Lime can create an odor, and it can, I think it's ammonium gas that it can create. Lime can cause finished pH, like when the compost is done breaking down, to be too high. You want it to be like right at basic. So if it's too high, it's not going to be as effective. And compost naturally becomes less acidic over time. So there's no reason to add lime because it's gonna be very acidic at first, but it will break down and become more basic as time goes on. And then layer 3 should just be soil. Soil contains microorganisms, and that's how your microorganisms get incorporated into your compost, and they're necessary for the breakdown of compost. And a layer of finished compost can be used as a substitute if you don't have good soil that you want to add. But yeah, during the breakdown period, the nitrogen is incorporated into the bodies of the microbes and is not available for plant use. And the nitrogen is released when decomposition is complete and the compost is returned to the garden. And for additional layers, just continue layering and alternating the layers until the pile is 3 to 5 feet high. And this is kind of just a baseline. If you have something that works better for you and has worked for your compost, obviously you can continue doing that, but this is kind of just a starting point. And then this kind of just goes through different nitrogen sources, different fertilizers or manures you can use, and then their percentage of nitrogen and how many ounces to apply to achieve 1 pound of nitrogen in your compost. So like ammonium nitrate has 33% nitrogen, and you would need 48 ounces to apply for 1 pound of nitrogen, and then just down the list for that. And I can send this out so you'll have this to refer back to if you need it. And like I was saying about pH, the pile will be very acidic at first. And it doesn't look like I put a period right there. I'll fix my mistakes before I send this out too. I didn't realize that. And by the time the process is complete, the pH should be close to neutral, like 7 to 7.2. And then conditions for composting. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, that one's especially important. Surface area of particles, aeration, moisture, and temperature. So carbon to nitrogen ratios, that's just an estimate of the relative amount of carbon and nitrogen in a material. Organisms that break down compost require large quantities of nitrogen, and that's kind of what I was talking about before. The breakdown period, the nitrogen is incorporated into the bodies of the microbes, and they use that. And then once decomposition is complete, the compost is returned to the garden, that's when that nitrogen becomes available for the garden to use. So the ratio is based on the percent dry weight in the material, and kind of think of carbon as the dry weight of the material you're including. So a ratio of 30 pounds to 1 pound is ideal. So that would be like 30 pounds of a carbon material will equal 1 pound of nitrogen. Balance can be achieved by controlling materials included in compost and adding nitrogen. And to estimate the carbon to nitrogen ratio of a mixture, average the ratios of the individual materials. So for example, if you have a mixture of equal parts grass clippings and leaves, you would add the carbon ratios. So that would be 20 for the grass clippings and 50 for the leaves, and then divide that by 2 because you have 2 materials, and that would equal 35 pounds of that mixture for 1 pound of nitrogen. And then I have a list of just a few examples of carbon to nitrogen ratios for different materials. And when it says 5 to 7, that just means 5 to 7 pounds of hog manure or 13 to 18 pounds of poultry manure. And like I said, I'll send this out because this is a good thing to be able to reference back to. And it's just simple math to figure out the ratio of your mixture. So surface area affects time needed for composting. Decreasing surface area allows bacteria to break down materials quicker, so you can chip or shred or mulch your materials before you include them in your compost, and it won't take as long for the microorganisms to break those things down. Aeration. Aeration incorporates oxygen into the materials, and oxygen is needed to support breakdown of materials. And turning the pile promotes aeration. And like I also said before, if you have your compost in a container, allowing oxygen to get into the sides of that container and reach all the different sides of the compost is also good. And then moisture, like I said earlier, compost should be of similar wetness of a wrung out sponge. Materials will decompose slowly if pile is too dry. So you'll want to turn the pile and mix materials, or if it's too wet, you can add brown materials. Because if it's too wet, there's probably like an overload of green materials and nitrogen. So adding those brown materials will even that back out. And then temperature. The heat of microorganism respiration causes temperature to rise dramatically. The center of a heap should be around 110 to 140 degrees in 4 to 5 days, like after you start. That's when the pile begins settling, and that's a sign that the pile is working properly. And heating of the pile kills some weed seeds and disease. So if you do happen to get a little bit of something that is infected or some kind of seeds or something in your pile, the high heat will kill those things. But proper turning is essential. Then turning compost. Turning promotes aeration, which promotes microorganism growth. Turning compost every 2 to 3 weeks produces usable compost in about 3 months. And wait at least 2 weeks to turn the pile for the first time. I know in that video I showed, like I said, they turned it every week and watered it every week. And if that works for you, then that's fine too. This is just extension recommendation. Make sure the materials in the center are brought to the outside when you're turning, and the outside materials are brought to the center when you're turning, because the materials on the outside of your container or your heap or whatever, they're going to be of a lower temperature than the center materials. So you want to make sure you incorporate all those materials into the center so it's an even heat and everything is getting broken down. Turning too frequently disrupts microorganism development. It seemed to work pretty good in the one video to turn every week, but I probably wouldn't do much more than that. And then stop turning the pile after November. And this is just because bacterial activity slows. Not turning the pile keeps the heat from escaping the pile's center, which is where all the bacteria are going to be. So if you're turning this pile throughout the cold months, you're losing the heat every time you turn the pile, and over time your bacteria will probably die, and you don't want that. So just some common issues in composting. You might notice an odor. That could mean it's too wet. So you can turn your pile to loosen it and promote aeration, and add brown materials because that'll kind of even out the wet green materials. Decomposition is not taking place. That means the pile is probably too dry. So you can add more green materials or just water it a little bit. It could be too hot. That means the pile is too small and more nitrogen is needed. And if it's not hot enough, you'll want to add nitrogen or green materials. I believe, oh, I have one more. And this is what good compost should look like once you're done. And then you could just apply that as a soil amendment in your garden. You may still want to use fertilizer just to achieve good soil for a good growing yield. But compost can add, like I said, to heavy clay soils. It can promote kind of the breakup and promote root growth and water infiltration. So kind of think of it more as a amendment to the soil rather than your primary fertilizer. That is my last slide. All right. Does anybody have any questions or anything you want to bring up? Any methods that you use in your compost that I didn't mention that work well for you?
Chloe, this is Hubie.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get free broken pallets from behind Rural King in Norton. And I did that, and I was able to create a fairly large compost area there, and with very little fixing necessary on those pallets. They're not good for loading things on, but they were great for creating the compost area. So if somebody needs to do it free, just keep checking there, and they throw those pallets out around back.
Yeah,
there's an area it's just free.
Yeah, thank you, Hubie. That's a good suggestion. There's like, you don't have to buy a big fancy compost bin or anything like that. You can use what you got. You can get free materials like Hubie said. So that's a really good thing. Anybody else have anything that y'all do or any questions?
I'll make a comment. It doesn't really affect the folks who are logged on today, but some of our other extension clientele, one of the things they have to deal with is disposing of dead livestock. Because burying that is going to cause a problem with groundwater, and sure, they don't want to leave it out. But I know University of Kentucky has done a lot of work with composting dead animals. And in a case like that, it's really important to follow those steps that you mentioned and make sure you got the proper heat and the proper mix of materials. But I know in one example that they used, just trying this system out, they had a 1,200 pound cow that was gone in 3 months. It's completely broken down. Just a few chalky bones is all that's left. But it's a good technique for some of our livestock producers to use. And it's amazing how effective a good compost pile can be at breaking things down.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Wow, a whole cow in 3 months. That's crazy. And that would be where kind of temperature and those kind of things would be the most important, especially if you're breaking down a big animal like that. So, Paxton, did you have something you were going to say?
No.
Okay.
Except I really did enjoy it. Thank you again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Does anybody else have anything? All right, well, if nobody else has any comments, questions, or concerns, my presentation tomorrow will be about GMOs, and I'll be back in the office, and then y'all can come into the office too if you want to, or just join over Zoom. And tomorrow's my last day, so I'm really sad. So I hope y'all all come see me tomorrow.
Yes, we'll see you tomorrow. Yes.
Okay. Y'all have a good day.
Thank you, Chloe.
You too.
Thank you all.